Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Lunch with Books live stream. I will introduce our guest in a moment. Just a couple of announcements. Next week at this time, on the 8th at noon, we will continue the Wheeling Poetry Series with Anna Egan Smucker and Bill King. And the host, as usual, will be West Virginia Poet Laureate Mark Harshman. So that's Wheeling Poetry Series. Now, this Thursday, we continue our People's University live stream summer, Bugs and People. Gene Kritzky was here last week. He was great. If you missed it, he'll be talking about cicadas this week, which are huge on the East Coast. I haven't seen any around here yet, but we do have a colony here in Wheeling. And that reminds me that you can win the Bob Villamagna artwork, Cicada, by coming in and taking a picture with our giant cicada and posting it online. It's fun. The artwork is awesome. Give it a try. Now, our guest today happens to be talking about one of my favorite subjects, anything to do with the Steelers, as most of you know, and some of you do not like about me, but hey, it's my show. And so we're here with Jim Wexell, and he's been at, I believe you talked about was it Steeler Nation?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
Yeah. He's Chicago by birth, and his favorite player is Walter Payton, which happens to be Troy's. And he's a graduate of the University of Pittsburgh and has covered the Steelers since 1995.
Right.
And this is an authorized biography. He talked to Troy, and right? Am I right about that? I hope.
I've talked to Troy throughout the years that I covered him, but he would not sit down for this, and I'll talk about that.
Okay, fair enough. But, well, most of us who are Steeler fans love Troy Polamalu, and he's, of course, recently inducted into the Hall of Fame. And Jim will also tell you how to get a copy of his biography of Troy. Here's Jim Wexell.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I don't know if any of you were back at the Wheeling Library in 2008 when I talked about Steeler Nation. It was quite a throng there. We're in a different kind of environment right now, but we're doing the best we can. I'm glad you could join us. As we talked about with Troy, I was covering the team in 2004 when he was drafted, and I worked for Steelers Digest as well. So they arranged a sit down with Troy the day after he was drafted. So I had the first sit down with Troy. And I also had the last interview with Troy. He called me for his retirement, and I broke that story. And in between, we talked often. It was best not to talk to Troy about football. Of course, if you're in a locker room and you're talking about the next game or the last game, he would talk about football. But it was not something he liked to talk about in his spare time. He liked to talk about soccer, his family, your family, God, religion, spirituality. There were some things I would like to talk to him about, and I'll talk to you about that today. This was, I approached Troy in 2010, and I had, for Steeler Nation, I had driven through Oregon and talked to his family there, and that's what got this rolling. I got to know his family, and they trusted me, and they liked me, and they were receptive to me doing a biography on Troy, and then it's a long story. I showed up at Troy's house in Southern California a few years later and talked to the Southern California aspect of Troy's family. But Troy, in about 2010, I broached the subject to him about a biography, and he said, I haven't even lived half my life. I haven't done anything. And he was the reigning defensive player of the year. And he said, talk to me in 5 years. Let me do something with my life first. Maybe I'll sit down with you then. And so it's funny. I had read a book, the biography of Neil Young, called Shaky. And there are several Neil Young biographies, and I liked Shaky quite a bit. Jim McDonough did the book, and he had trouble getting Neil to sit down. So what Jim McDonough did, he started writing, and he interviewed the entire chronological history and geography of Neil Young, and finally got Neil to sit down, and he put Neil's interview and comments on all of the topical moments of Neil's life and all of the highlights and the neighbors and the mom and girlfriends and ex-wives, and he would use italics to top off the chronology of Neil's life. And that's what I decided I wanted to do with the Troy biography. So I began studying Troy and getting interviews and beginning the whole process of Troy's life. Well, Troy never did sit down, and by now I've gotten so many interviews and so much in-depth reporting from his family and people close to him and friends and everybody. His wife sat down and talked to me, and they told me things that Troy would never have told me. Ryan Clark talking about the genius behind Troy's particular play, and the Joe Flacco moments, the Raven moments, the Atlanta Falcon moments, Ryan Clark and Ike Taylor and Chris Hope, all those guys, and also Troy in the locker room for 12 years. I kept all detailed notes through those years. And I came upon a biography of Stevie Ray Vaughan. I love rock and roll biographies. And I like that approach that a Steeler fan, Alan Paul, the author of that book, who also authored the Allman Brothers book, both of them were what they call oral histories. And I decided that since Troy wasn't going to sit down with me, that I would do an oral history. And what you get with that, this is the book here. It's $32.95. It's expensive, but you'll see the quality of this book, and there's color pictures, and it's a heavy book. It's really well put together. But for instance, this is the USC section. I've got Matt Leinart. I've got you can see how the people speak. This is Carson Palmer over here. And you've got Lenny Vandermeide, who's in Troy's family and also played for USC, and on it went like that. It's an oral history, and it's very easy reading, and the cast of characters are in the beginning. So if you forget which Polamalu I'm talking to, you can look it back up. Oh, it's his uncle. And so I did an oral history, and I had Alan Paul edit it. I called him. I said, I'm stealing your style. I'd also like you to edit it. And he did, being a Steeler fan, and he loved Troy. So the reason I told you about the Jim McDonough book is I got a review from somebody on Amazon that wrote, this book reminded me of Shaky. I never told anybody that I was going to do it that style until I changed gears and made it an oral history. I don't understand where he got that from, but he's right on. That was my intention for 10 years to do it that way, but Troy never did sit down with it. And for many reasons, and I've talked to other people, they agree that I think if I were to just sit down with Troy and have done more, I wouldn't have done as much research. I wouldn't have got as much in depth. I talked to his uncle Kennedy, who, for instance, drove him around after his final game, the Ravens game in 2014. And Troy was hurt. He was beat up. He lost. He didn't know his end of his career was at hand, but he wasn't in the greatest mood, of course. But Kennedy talked about how they went out to dinner that night, and Troy, of course, bought too much food. That'll become a theme in the book if you read it. Troy bought too much food, and he kept making his Uncle Kennedy stop to feed homeless people. And Troy would never have told me any of that, but other people did, and so. That's just an example of what Troy would never have told me due to his humility. And that's why he didn't sit down for the book. We have a great relationship. He just shudders at the idea of an entire book about himself. If he were to have engaged with me completely as I wanted, he would have had to have sat down and edit it and read it, make sure it's all right. He would not have wanted to read a book about himself. That's just not in his wiring. He's not wired that way. So I think it worked out best that way. But that was the one aspect that I would have liked to have talked to Troy about. All the plays that he made, everybody else put a pretty good description of what happened. I've talked to a ton of assistant coaches, Dick LeBeau, Ray Horton, his college assistants, opposing assistants and head coaches. they would not have gone. Troy would not have gone into the detail. He would have remained too humble. And but the one aspect I did want to talk to Troy about, and hopefully he can address this in an interview. And it's funny, my daughter wants to do a book on meditation in sports, and I told her, I said, it's got to start with Troy, because he put meditation and prayer and clarity of mind and what Craig Wolfley described as motion. Craig Wolfley was a sideline reporter, of course, and really was on top of Troy the entire time, really admired how Troy went about it and cleared his head and was in prayer on the sideline, but there was also meditation, and it was the clarity of mind, and of course, all the in-depth studying that Troy did of film. Mike Logan went into depth about Troy's fanaticism of watching film. That's why he hated to talk about football or watch football in his free time. He was saturated with tape. He watched it from every angle, just studied it like nobody that players on the Steelers had ever seen before. And I wanted to talk to Troy, though, about all of the mindfulness. We're all involved. I think we're in the era of mindfulness now, the law of attraction, The Secret, all of that thing. Troy mixed it, of course, with prayer. Prayer was his number one thing. I doubt if he would even call it mindfulness, but I would like to get his take on all of that. It's funny. People say, well, Troy was lucky to, he went to USC when he did, and then Pete Carroll came, and then he went to the Steelers, and then Dick LeBeau came. Troy was lucky to have all these breaks happen. Bill Cowher said in the first paragraph, the first chapter of the book, I talked about the drafting. It was a great draft story of how they ended up with Troy. And Bill Cowher said, he had a line like, boy, Troy's going into the Hall of Fame. It's a wonder. It makes you wonder what would have happened if he didn't end up here in the perfect system. And the next line was, it's a wonder what would have, if Troy put Bill Cowher in the Hall of Fame as well. But all these supposed breaks that happened to Troy, he was a bit of a juvenile delinquent as a child. And the last thing he stole was a Bible in the 6th grade. And he had explained in a magazine that God let him off the hook for stealing a Bible, but it was the last thing he stole, and he was in 6th grade. And that's when his spirituality really took off, probably senior year of high school at Douglas High in Oregon. And then Troy ended up at USC, and he was supposed to go to Colorado, but I believe it's in the book. Excuse me for not knowing the exact details, but Rick Neuheisel was let go. But anyway, Troy had accepted to go to Colorado, where his uncle Kennedy was an assistant coach. And Kennedy told him, "Hey, Troy, I can't promise you I'll be the assistant coach for the next coach. So you might want to start looking at other schools." And Troy, he went to Washington State, Oregon, all those schools up there in the rain-drenched Pacific Northwest. And he was at Washington State, and he told Uncle Kennedy, he said, "Uncle, get me out of the rain." And so Troy ended up at USC, and Kennedy didn't get a job at USC, but he got a job at San Diego State and told Troy, "I'll be there next year." He would not explain why he had that promise, but Kennedy was behind the recruiting of Troy to go to USC, and he ended up there, and Paul Hackett was the coach. Paul Hackett complained, it was in the LA papers, that Paul Hackett complained that we don't have enough defensive backs in this recruiting class, and we don't have enough out-of-state recruits. That's the only problem I have with this class. And of course, he had the greatest defensive back and greatest out-of-state recruit USC ever recruited in the same package in Troy Polamalu. And then Paul Hackett was fired 2 years in, and the great DB coach Pete Carroll came and really put Troy's talents to use. So did Troy get lucky, or did he manifest it? I would like to know. I would like to know, Troy, how did you manifest that happening? How did your clarity of mind and your prayers, and how did you put all this together? Did you know you were putting it together? Was it your intention? Those are the things I want to know. But it's a theme that keeps coming up throughout the book. And then, of course, he goes to the Steelers, and Tim Lewis is the defensive coordinator, and he has a year left on his contract after Troy's uneventful rookie year, uninspired rookie year, a rookie year that had people calling him a bust. And at the end of that year, Tim Lewis was telling fans in the parking lot in Baltimore, waiting for the bus to get warmed up, Tim Lewis was overheard telling Steeler fans that he's going to get fired. And somebody went to Dan Rooney and said, who's going to replace Tim Lewis? And Dan said, I don't know what you're talking about. Well, he's telling people he's going to get fired. And this was news to Dan Rooney. And Dan Rooney called Bill Cowher in. And the guy who overheard it, he got a phone call. This is Dan Rooney. I have you on speakerphone with Bill Cowher. Could you repeat what happened to me? What you told me about Tim Lewis yesterday? And so when Bill Cowher heard that Tim Lewis was telling people he was going to get fired with 1 year left on his contract and the 10th rated defense in the NFL, even though they were 6-10, Bill Cowher fired him and brought in Dick LeBeau. Who was of course, he's presenting Troy in the Hall of Fame, but he was a perfect coach for Troy. He put it all together, made Troy a superstar, made the Steelers 2-time NFL champions and a 3rd Super Bowl as well. How did Troy manifest Dick LeBeau when Tim Lewis was set? How did that all happen? I would like to know. And I let me read you something. As far as the spirituality is what interests me today. I mean, there are a lot of topics in this book that we could go into, but I want to read something Bill Cowher told me, and it's on page 184. It's in the second year, the 2004 season, when they went 15-1. It was Troy's first year as a starter. Bill Cowher said, Troy's a religious guy, right? He'd go to mass on Saturday night. He'd go to chapel on Sunday morning. One time I asked him, what denomination are you? Are you Catholic? Are you Presbyterian? Are you Baptist? And Troy said, no, I just like all religion. I like it all. Okay, Cowher says. So in 2005, we're playing against the Chargers, and we got a blitz zone called, they call it blitz zone. The coaches call it blitz zone instead of zone blitz. I left it as Cowher called it, blitz zone. We had a blitz zone called, and LaDainian Tomlinson circles out on a flare, and Troy takes the tight end. There's a miscommunication between him and James Ferrier. Both are on the tight end, and no one's on the swing pass. He goes like 50 yards on a Monday night, and they kick a field goal in the 4th quarter for the lead. We come off the field, and I'm talking to the kick return team. And then I wanted to talk to Troy because this thing was all screwed up. I go, Troy. And all of a sudden, Chris Hope goes, oh, coach, you can't talk to Troy. I said, what do you mean? He goes, he's praying. I said, what do you mean he's praying? He said, he's praying. You can't talk to him right now. I said, well, how long is he going to be praying? He goes, it's going to be a while. I'll come and get you. I go, well, I've got to talk to you guys about what took place out there, Chris. He goes, I'll come and get you, coach, but you can't mess with Troy while he's praying. Okay, Cowher says, God dang, I've got to talk to you. But I had to go back up there because we're getting ready to go on offense. Years later, I told Troy, I will always remember coming over to talk to you, and Chris Hope would always stop me and say, I couldn't talk to you when you were praying. Troy said, coach, I used to always tell Chris that I think coach is mad at me. If he comes over, I'll put my head down. You tell him I'm praying. So I don't know how much of that is true. I believe what Cowher knows to be true. I don't know if Troy was teasing him. We all know Troy was always deep in prayer on the sideline, ceaseless prayer on the field. I would like to hear Troy's explanation of that. Was he praying? Was he meditating? What was going on? Anyway, I talked to Craig Wolfley later in the book, and these themes keep coming up about how Troy just had an eye for what was going to happen. And Craig Wolfley explained it as motion. It's mind/no mind. It's when you stop the self-chatter. The Americanized version of it, it's the zone. People talk about letting the play come to them. Some people just have it. I think Minkah Fitzpatrick is someone who's going to be very much like that. Some guys I've known who were tremendous athletes, but they just couldn't get outside the norm. Very strong players, but once the X's and O's started moving, they lost their minds. They couldn't seem to adjust, be creative, understand the flow of the game. Troy was all about flow. For years, I trained in jiu-jitsu. This is Wolfley talking. For years, I trained in jiu-jitsu with Rickson Gracie, one of the earliest of the jiu-jitsu masters from the Gracie family, coming up from Brazil in the 80s. He used to say, you've got the flow with the go. It's a very descriptive term that means you just turn off the chatter and do it. And that's what Troy, in my most humble estimation, is. The boundaries that contain a lot of other players defined by you're the free safety, you're the strong safety, you do this, you do that. Troy really exploded all of that. And we talk with Dick LeBeau about the alleged freelancing that Troy did Troy would bristle whenever that came up. He did not freelance, as national media would describe his play as. But I like this part about the Mushin and Troy meditating and praying and seeing that it was the time to dive over the line of scrimmage. When Troy started doing that, Mike Tomlin called those dives over the line of scrimmage, in which he timed it perfectly and would sack Joe Flacco. His first one was Kerry Collins at the goal line in a game against the Texans. That's where Troy really saw that it was happening now, and to go now and to fly. Tomlin said that was the most incredible thing that he saw Troy do, because once you take off, there's no going back. And Troy was never offsides. He was called offsides once. And I told Troy in the locker room, I said, well, they finally caught you offsides. He goes, was I? I'm like, well, they called it offsides. The play blew up. They blew the whistles. He goes, was I? I went home and looked frame by frame. He was not. He timed it perfectly. But anyway, it's fine. I said to Wolfley, Troy's cousin, Brandon, who he grew up with, is closest to Troy's age in Oregon. His cousin, Brandon, is a college professor right now, very, very bright young man. He brought up how Troy began studying Walter Payton. If you notice, the number of Walter Payton is 34 and Troy's 43. And there's a good section in the book about Troy always wanted number 41, and he kept being given 43. And you can read about that in the book. But so he wasn't trying to have Walter Payton's same digits, but it's how my favorite player was Walter Payton, the greatest, sweetest guy ever, and Troy, that was his idol too, growing up. And Brandon talked about how Troy studied Walter Payton, especially if you ever saw the YouTube video of Walter Payton's hill that he used to run. So Troy became really immersed in Walter Payton. And Brandon said, the guy he really began to study when he got serious about his body and spiritualism in his body, in his training, was Rickson Gracie. And I'm not a MMA fan. Some of you might know Rickson Gracie better. But later in the book, when Craig Wolfley talked about it, it started to make sense. And so I told Wolfley about Troy studying Rickson Gracie, and Wolfley had just brought up Rickson Gracie in this Mushin conversation. And Wolfley said, a guy like Rickson Gracie really makes me think about Troy, because Rickson was always about, I'm ageless. I don't discuss my age. I flow with the go, and how jujitsu is a lifestyle and a discipline. It's not what you do, it's who you are. That's kind of how I view Troy. Troy was more than a football player. It was who he was, but it's who you are. And Troy is bigger than football in many ways. And so I looked up, I looked up Mushin, and I was trying to understand it better. And I just happened upon a YouTube video of Alan Watts, who is in the mindfulness genre. And he's older. I'm not even sure if he's still alive. And you may have heard of Alan Watts. I barely know much about him, but he began talking about Mushin in one of his talks. It's about no mind. A person who has Mushin, or no mind, or no heart, as they say in Chinese, is a very high order of person. It means that his psychic center doesn't get in its own way. It operates as if it wasn't there. And that's Troy. I mean, as mindful and as prayerful as he was, it was more of a mind clearing and letting God and the spiritualism of the moment take his body, move his feet the way God wanted it to, the way his mind, which was free of encumbrances that kill all of us when we desire something, when we work for something. Our negative feelings get in the way, and Troy cleared his head of all of that and was able to see things before they happened. And it would go along with all of his tape study. He just saw what was happening on the field, and just made him a beautiful player, as you all know. I've got about 6 minutes left. I'm going to talk about since I'm on a Craig Wolfley kick here, I looked up his interview, and Troy was difficult to follow, especially for a guy like Carson Palmer, who was his roommate in college, a close friend. And as we know, in 2004, Troy's first big play was intercepting Carson Palmer, returning it for a touchdown, and trucking Carson Palmer at the goal line. Carson Palmer said his shoulder still hurts from that play. And so some years later, Troy was playing Cincinnati again, and Carson Palmer was again confounded. And I was talking to Wolfley, the sideline reporter, who really took a study of Troy. And Wolfley told me Todd Blackledge, who was the quarterback during Wolfley's the misbegotten 1980s. Troy Blackledge was quarterback here for a year. And he said Todd Blackledge always used to talk about the 7-yard walk. Excuse me. The most important walk for a quarterback. That was breaking the huddle, coming to the line of scrimmage, and viewing the defense from the back to the front. Where are the safeties? What's the coverage like? Linebackers, defensive front? So that's the quarterback's take on coming out of the huddle. So one of the best examples, Wolfley said, they were playing Cincinnati, and Cincinnati was backed up inside the 10. They were huddling in the back of the end zone. I walked around and stood behind the back of the end zone to get the end zone view. Troy was back where it looked like he would be in coverage over the tight end, about 15 yards deep. Carson was walking up, looking over. Obviously, he's looking for Troy. He goes under center, and Troy starts to jog forward. And then he comes just behind Clark Haggans, the edge to my right, and Joey Porter was to the left. So Troy's about 2 yards deeper than Clark Haggans. And then he starts to jog lateral to the line of scrimmage. He's behind Brett Kiesel. He's behind Snack. He's behind Ferrier and Foote. And he's going in between these guys in the 3-4 base Okie. So he gets behind Joey Porter and then gets to the line of scrimmage outside Joey. Now Carson has broken the cadence off a couple of times while watching this unfold. He's just moving. And I'm sitting here wondering if he was going to try to Superman him, dive over the line. Carson was just staring at him while rotating his head and watching Troy. And Troy ends up finally at the outside behind Porter after starting 15 yards behind Clark Haggans. And finally, Carson goes with whatever he's got called, and at the snap of the ball, Troy zooms back, and he's in cover 3 about 30 yards deep. How do you even begin to assimilate a play and try to run something when a guy's capable of doing that? It's bizarre. It's one of the most amazing moments I've ever seen as a player, totally disguising his intentions. Who would think he'd be in the middle of cover 3? I don't know. But this book, I focused on the meditation and the spirituality of Troy that I really wish I could investigate with Troy a little further. Would he ever give his tips away? I wrote this book for all of us, and there's enough salty language from Joey Porter, Alan Faneca, all the players talking about the Super Bowl inside the game. It became 430 pages because when I was researching, I was going to do 2 books. One on the 2 Super Bowl championship teams and one on Troy, but I merged them together. It became 430 pages, a little expensive at $32.95. But I think it's worth it. It's well put together. It's actually a perfect Father's Day gift. It's a quality gift. And he will begin in the first chapter, sucks you right in with the draft story of Mike Miller, an offensive assistant who convinced the room the day before the draft. And Bill Cowher and Kevin Colbert have not admitted. I did not ask them, but putting them on the spot. They admitted they talked about how everything Mike Miller told me became true, and they followed that timeline that Mike Miller provided of how they ended up trading up for Troy. It's a really good chapter. But I lost my train of thought. But I wanted to write it for kids, all kids, high school kids, how to train, how to get up off the mat when things are going bad, how to deal with things when they're going good. Troy was just a perfect example of all of this, how not to get caught up in reading your clippings, how not to do books on yourself, let other people do the talking. I did send the Troy household a book, and we had raised $10,000 over Christmas when we sold this book, and we're going to do another charity dealing with Troy's foundation. Now I sent the check and a book to Troy, and Theodora, Troy's wife, called me and said, "Thank you for the book and the money, and Troy is so happy, and we're trying to find a way to thank you." I said, "No thanks is necessary. He gave me 12 years of his life. Everything he could do in a locker room, he did for me." But I wanted this for young people to use Troy as an example, and and that's what Theodore told me. The 12-year-old son, Paisios, had commandeered the book, and no one else was able to read it. And he had his nose in it. And I was so proud because he was a 12-year-old boy. And it's not written for 12-year-olds. Like I said, there's salty language in it enough, not too much by any means, but this is a perfect book for 12-year-olds and for dads. And I've lost my train of thought on exactly. I wanted the book to be about, diet and working out. And Troy has a unique take on all of those things, and people talking about what Troy did, how he did it. And but the one thing that kind of eluded me, and hopefully my daughter gets to it in her book, Meditation in Sports, is how Troy's spirituality, the specifics, what was his discipline, how much prayer, how much meditation, how much did he think it helped his football? So that maybe part 2 to come, but I think there's enough thematically and symbolic in this book. Things like that keep coming up, and it makes you think at least about all the things Troy did and how he went about it. But it is available at jimwexell.com. It's available at Amazon as well. For whatever reason, Barnes & Noble and Books A Million, they need a third party to take more of the money, and they want to send the book to Chicago. And when I have all the books in Irwin, Pennsylvania, I can distribute. They want to make it difficult, and they also want me to pull it from Amazon if it's going to go in Barnes & Noble. So those are some of the problems of getting it into the brick and mortars these days. But it's on Amazon. But jimwexell.com, you can press the contact Jim after you buy the book. Go back into the website, contact me, and say, I just bought a book. And if you would sign it to my dad, somebody today, to Tom. He's from Nanny Glow, so I could put a little a blurb about Nanny Glow in there and then sign it. It makes for a nice Father's Day gift on June 20th. So if you go to jimwexell.com, I would recommend that and getting a nice book for your dad for Father's Day. But I guess we're open for questions now. It's 12:32. If Sean wants to lead me through that.
Yeah, I'm here, Jim. You'll notice on my banner there, I did put "makes a great Father's Day gift." So
thank you so much.
I was one step ahead of you. But I'm a big fan of Troy. All of us Steeler fans are. But he's a transcendent player to me. I've never seen anybody like him. Have you?
No, like I before I said, Walter Payton comes close to a degree. Walter Payton let me down one time though. In the Super Bowl, he didn't get the ball at the goal line and he pouted. And I thought that's not you, Walter. Don't do this. You didn't get the ball. It's okay. You won the game. Apparently, it was a big deal for Walter Payton, and I always wonder what the heck, Walter. But Troy did not let me down, other than he wouldn't sit down for the book. But that's just Troy, and that is fitting
because of his humility.
It's fitting, exactly. All the things we're talking about in the book, Troy would have blown all that up by sitting down and talking about himself. That's not what he does.
Right. And so we have a question from Bob, our friend Bob Gaudio. I'll let you read it.
Carson Palmer. I got a little bit of Terrell Suggs. I was waiting for more, and that didn't come about. Opposing coaches. I'm trying to think. Brian Billick. A little bit of Brian Billick. Coaches who went elsewhere, like Ray Horton, but nothing too much. I should look through the cast of characters. There's over 50 interviews that he sat down for me. I'm trying to. Dennis Thurman was Troy's USC secondary coach, and then coached Ed Reed at Baltimore. So he had not only interesting takes on Baltimore's feelings before the draft, also his take on the Ed Reed versus Troy Polamalu. And we also had other coaches who coached some of the great safeties. Ray Horton was involved with Sean Taylor, and but Dennis Thurman played with Ronnie Lott. That's where I'm getting Ronnie Lott from. He played with Ronnie Lott. He coached Troy at college, and then he coached Ed Reed. And there's a lot of good. Ray Horton was with the Detroit Lions when Troy was drafted, and he kept telling the Lions how much he liked Troy Polamalu, and they're drafting third, and they're like, "What are you talking about? That guy's so overrated." And he said when the Steelers traded up for Troy, the entire draft room in Detroit turned around and looked at Ray, and Ray says, "I told you this guy can play," and he said, "Well, he can't play like Charles Rogers, our guy, our pick at number 3." And Ray said, "I'll tell you what. I bet you Troy makes more catches in the NFL than Charles Rogers does." And Troy, of course, is a defensive back. Right. And I went back and looked. I mean, Ray was just being facetious, I think. I went back and looked. Troy had 34 picks, counting playoff games, and Charles Rogers had 36 catches. So it almost came true.
Yeah.
But and there's the reasoning. You have an 0-16 team at the time. Right. So but Ray Horton was really good. But so I guess I don't have too many opponents to talk. Carson Palmer was really good, being with the Bengals and being with Troy at USC.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned Ronnie Lott. There have been a lot of great safeties, Ed Reed. Even the Steelers had Donnie Shell and Mike Wagner and guys like that. But Troy was a disruptive machine. I mean, I've never seen anyone play the way he does or did. And you think a lot of that had to do with his spirituality, you think?
Spirituality, his thirst in the film room, and his athleticism. I mean, he ran a 4.3. Yeah. And the natural strength. Some of the guys, Sean Newell would talk about, they still think he holds records at USC. Snatch, clean and snatch, things like that, just pure power stuff. And then he all of a sudden stopped with the weights. He got involved with Marv Marinovich in his college days back in LA. And it was more, the guys talked about trying to do Troy's workouts, even though it was all bands and 20-pound weights. They said it was way more intense than the heavyweight workouts that they were used to. And they said Troy used to walk into the weight room and laugh at the guys throwing up 400, 500 pounds. Troy could sit down on the bench and throw one up easily, and just to show people that he was still naturally strong. But he was naturally strong. He holds all the Douglas High weightlifting records still, of course. But Sean Newell was telling me, Sean Newell came from the exact island, the exact town in the same island that the Polamalu family did. Troy was born in California, but the family was born in Samoa at a small island where the great king of all of Samoa came from, and he's linked to Troy. And supposedly the god that they believe in Samoa is linked to this king. Therefore, Troy is from the gods, Sean Newell says. He said, but don't bring this up with Troy. He does not like this topic. Troy is a firm follower of Jesus Christ, and Troy does not believe that he is from a god or a king. He does not want to believe any of that. But Sean Newell is now an assistant. He's an assistant coach at Michigan. He's the defensive line coach, and his dad is still the talking chief in that village in Samoa. But Sean said that, I said, Sean, you got to, Troy's methods work. You've got to get your defensive lineman at Michigan to stop lifting weights and start doing Polamalu workouts. He said, I don't have that much pull here. And he's like, the head coach would not appreciate that. He goes, when I'm coaching my own team, maybe BYU, then I will institute the Polamalu, no weights in our training. But otherwise, I have to wait.
You mentioned that he's Christian. I don't know if you mentioned what particular denomination, because we used to see him crossing himself repeatedly on the sideline and wondered if he was Catholic, but I don't think he was. I don't know.
Greek Orthodox.
That's right. I think I did hear that somewhere. Yeah.
I think they have 2-hour services, right? And so that fits Troy, the longer the better for him.
That's interesting. Was he the greatest player other than Peyton that you saw, or just one of your favorites?
One of my favorites. I hesitate to get into the greatest player. And, every time I say Tom Brady, I get heckled.
Yeah.
If quarterback is the most important position in all of sports, I don't care if the guy runs a 5'1" 40 and is gangly as Tom Brady is or was coming out. He might be the greatest athlete we are in the midst of watching, but everybody balks at the word athlete. But if quarterback is the most important position in all of sports, I got to think Tom Brady. We do talk about the cheating, and Troy had to talk about the Patriots cheating too. He gave me a quote that was off the record that I pulled out because he asked me, "What do you think?" And he approached me on the topic, and so we talked. And he felt that he thought that either Bill Belichick is the greatest coach who ever lived, and that he nailed every one of our blitzes, or there's something funny going on here. But I got to give it to Brady. The greatest, Troy, he fits in that conversation. If it wasn't for his Achilles, and it's funny, I touched on that a little bit. He came from USC. His name's Troy. He was named after USC, the Trojans. Trojans were, I believe it was, I got it straight in my book, the Greek mythology. Troy was a country where the Trojans came from, and they went to fight Sparta, I think. I have it straight in the book, but Troy was named for USC. His uncle talked to his mother, and he was named right for the college he was going to end up at. And, and then he hurt his Achilles tendon, and that kind of bugged him for the last 4 or 5 years of his career. So if it wasn't for that, he could have gone down as the greatest. And, I'm not going to disagree. I'm not going to say he wasn't. I'll give Ed Reed the great ball hawk. He might have been the greatest free safety, but Troy was the greatest strong safety. So put them together. And Dennis Thurman, who was in the Baltimore draft room at the time Troy was up, and they had Ed Reed, said he still recommended Troy, that it wouldn't have been a waste to have two great safeties like that, because they did two different things, and they could have both done each other's jobs too, to fool quarterbacks, to disguise better. And that, yes, he tried to get Baltimore thinking about Troy. They had other issues, and so I'm not sure that I can say Troy was the greatest safety, but he was the greatest strong safety, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, if I'm picking a strong safety, it's going to be Troy Polamalu, that's for sure. But those, you mentioned Ed Reed. I don't know what that is. That a siren?
That is a siren.
Your mic's picking it up.
Should I shut the window?
We're fine. It stopped.
Okay. I hope they're not coming to take me away, but at least for the next 15 minutes.
Those games with Baltimore, as good as the rivalry still is, when he played with Ed Reed and Troy and Flacco and Porter and those guys, that was epic. Those games were always epic. And I was worried someone might get killed. I mean, seriously, they played with such intensity. What was my question going to be?
Well, let me add this. There was one particular game when Haloti Ngata punched Ben Roethlisberger in the nose in the first series, broke his nose, blood all over the place. That was just the start of probably the most physical of them all. It was a 13-10 game. I believe it was in 2010. Heath Miller was concussed in that game. Just some brutal blasts in that game. And yes, what a physical series. I know a lot of football people love that series, but I don't. I used to get headaches. I don't know if I felt the hits in the press box. I used to get headaches watching it. It was a little too brutal.
It was. I dreaded those games because I thought they were going to be carrying people out on a stretcher, and it was just too intense. It made me sick almost.
Right.
And I went back to the Raiders, Steelers, in the
right.
old days. It was similar. But this was during the new era when the rules were different, and they still managed to make a war out of it.
As Troy put it, pansy ball.
Right.
It sure wasn't. Yeah,
No.
might be now, but boy, they tried to change the rules, but those boys weren't listening. And the ratings told the league, leave these guys alone.
Right.
It's like Ben walked out for the second series. He said, I said to the ref, didn't you see that Nada punched me right in the face? And he said, no, it was incidental. And Ben said, didn't you see the blood all over the place? And the ref said, that's part of the game. Ben said, I just couldn't argue. So.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Brutal games. But my point was Troy always rose to the occasion. Like his intensity in those games was above
Unbelievable. There's a full section about the big play, the game at Heinz Field that they call it the greatest game ever played at Heinz Field. His pick six in the AFC Championship game, and it would have been 2009 in January of 2009, the 2008 season. That the place was rocking more than it ever was, and I cannot confirm that because I was not there. I cover every game except that one. I had a pass to cover the Senior Bowl, and I had airline tickets paid out of my own pocket, and I could not change. And so I watched that game on a screen in Mississippi.
Wow.
So, sometimes things happen right for you as a sports writer, and sometimes you really get inside your own head and mess yourself up.
But, Jim, it's great to hear about an athlete, that we admire, who's an admirable person for a change. And so.
Absolutely. That was one of the beautiful things of this book. I knew I wasn't, everybody likes to dig up dirt so that it becomes a blurb and then really sells your book. Yeah. I got no dirt for that. I got nothing close. And so maybe that's part of the reason Barnes and Noble won't have it. So, and I told Troy, I said, obviously, Troy, I'm not going to be looking for dirt. There is none except for that Bible you stole in 6th grade. But, and everybody, that's why people would call me back, Ryan Clark, Ike Taylor, everybody called me back right away. Heath Miller, someone gave me Heath Miller's number and said, don't expect him to call you back. He doesn't call anyone back. And that surprised me because Heath is such a nice guy. He really is. He's what you see.
Yeah.
And I called Heath and he called me right back. And the reception kept going in and out on the phone. And he'd say, is this better? I'm in the corner. I said, are you living in Virginia? He lives in Appalachia down there in far western Virginia, near Kentucky. And he said, yeah, and you know how the mountains are there. And so his reception was poor, and I figured that's why he doesn't call anyone back. But he said, how about if tomorrow I get a better placed reception and we do this interview then? I said, it'd be great, Heath. So an hour later, the phone rings. It's Heath. He goes, hey, I got in my car and drove to the top of a hill. He pulled it off to the side of the road and gave me an hour about Troy Polamalu. That's how these guys were. And they weren't wary of me looking for dirt because there's no dirt to find, even if I was looking for it. Everything about Troy is all good. And there was one, if you remember when Heath tore his ACL in like the next to last game of the year, it might have been 2012, something like that. And Heath had a monster year and was voted the team MVP. But since he was out with his injury for the last week, he wasn't in the locker room and couldn't comment on being the MVP. Not that he would say much, So I got this idea. I went to Troy. I said, how humble is Heath? Who's more humble, you or Heath? Troy said, oh my God, it's Heath by a long shot. I said, you're just saying that. He goes, no, I have to. He goes, I have to work at it. Heath is natural. And he's right. If you've ever talked to Heath, he's just natural. Where Troy has had his moments. One time, Anthony Smith, you remember the safety, Anthony Smith, knocked the gold teeth out of the Ocho Cinco for the Bengals.
Oh.
And I would have my binoculars on it, And Troy picked up the gold teeth and gave them to Ocho Cinco. And in the locker room, I said to Anthony, I said, what did you knock out of Ocho Cinco's mouth? He goes, oh, it was his gold teeth. And I said, Troy picked them up. He goes, yeah, Troy picked them up and gave them to him. So I went to Troy. I said, what was that you gave to Ocho Cinco? He goes, oh, his mouth guard. I said, well, Anthony Smith told me it was his gold teeth. And Troy goes, well, then why'd you ask me? Troy hates to lie. He won't lie, but he does not want a huge story. And so I caught him in a little white lie, and it just bugs him. And that's Troy. Heath would have just smiled. That's how Heath is naturally humble, naturally nice. And Troy does have to work at it, meditate about it, being a nice guy, being humble. And so, yes, I agreed with Troy that Heath is a more natural. Well, I brought this interview up to Heath. It was years later, and when Heath was pulled off to the side of the road, I told him about what Troy said. He goes, yeah, someone showed me that interview years later. He goes, what else would the guy who's more humble say than what Troy said? He goes, no, Troy's the more humble. So these two guys had a humble off. They would not say the other, they were more humble because, Ben Franklin had like 10 things he wanted to accomplish with his life. And number 10 was being humble. And I guess on his deathbed or something, they asked him, did you accomplish all of your 10 things? And he said, no. And the postscript was that he could not say he accomplished it all because then, therefore, the humility would be gone if he said he was humble. So here we got Heath Miller and Troy Polamalu, and Heath talked about it. It was really good. And I talked to other players. Who was more humble? It was the humble off section. And they all agreed that, it was Heath. So kudos to Heath, even natural. And Troy nailed it.
It's good we had two on the same team. That's on offense and defense. So
it's how special that team was.
They really were.
I talked to guys, and I kind of trying to get them to talk a little about Roethlisberger. Now, how come no one's talking about Roethlisberger? They said, Jim, and I'm expecting, he didn't go to meetings. He made us mad. The defense was always mad at. There's always been those rumors about Roethlisberger's early years where he lacked work ethic. And the defense was supposedly mad, but nobody would go into this. They say, Jim, it's because the defense carried his team. And we know as soon as they drafted Ben, we took off, but it wasn't about Ben. The 2004, the difference between 2003 and 2004 was Dick LeBeau came and Troy blossomed. And our defense came together, and that's why it wasn't Ben. Everybody wants to point to Ben. So we don't want to give Ben all that credit, even though obviously he deserves credit. But it was the defense that carried that team. And if you look, as Joey Porter pointed out, there's nobody else from that defense that's going to make the Hall of Fame except Troy. So Troy carried the defense that carried the team to 2 Super Bowl titles. So while we might want to look at Ben Roethlisberger as the MVP through all of that, it probably was Troy. And I have him as the Holy Spirit of the locker room. And I talked to the religious guys, whether I was taking liberties that I shouldn't be taking by calling him the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is defined both Christian and Judeo religions as the small voice of God. And if there was a smaller voice than Troy Polamalu, small voice of God, he fits that description. You've heard his voice. He's just not a booming guy. He's not a talker. But when he talked, people did listen. But he was the small voice of God. Whether calling him the Holy Spirit of that team is getting carried away and being the word escapes me when you're slapping religion in the face, but a lot of the religious people agreed. Yes, that's a good analogy. Some of them were offended. No, he's not the Holy Spirit. Let's not go there. But that's how I took it. I thought Troy Polamalu was the Holy Spirit of that great era of Steelers football.
I think it's actually a good metaphor, and
thank you.
He probably wouldn't accept it because he's humble, but
he might punch me.
There's truth in it, Jim, and that's a good note to end on. Okay. Let's remind people of how they can get the book, jimwexell.com.
jimwexell.com, and when you purchase the book, it doesn't give you the option to contact me on the purchase page. But if you go back into the website, you'll see a contact Jim button at the very bottom of the front page. It goes right to me. I'll respond right away. I got you. Say my dad's name is Tony, and he, is the greatest fan in Euclid, Ohio. And I could say Euclid's greatest Steelers fan. Happy Father's Day, Tony. Something like that. It makes it special for him, and we can rip it off in the mail. That's at jimwexell.com. You can get it at Steeler stores too, at Tanger Outlets in Washington. I know you're close to that a bit. And also Amazon, if you want to give Jeff Bezos 40% of the money.
Let's not do that.
But I get 60%. So.
Oh yeah. Well,
and then I can pay my taxes.
It's still better if they buy from you, though, right?
Yeah, jimwexell.com. It's just spelling the name, and I'm glad you have the scroll on. It's an easy buy, and you can contact me. And if things aren't working, if for whatever reason the postal service isn't getting the book to you, you have my contact, and we'll get it done.
All right. Great Father's Day gift. Go get your book. I'm going to get mine. And reminder, next week, Wheeling Poetry Series continues. Anna Smucker. And, oh gosh, I forgot the second. Let me get his name. Before we go, it's Bill King. Bill King, a great poet. Mark Parchman is the host. Jim, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you to everybody for watching.
Thanks for attending, and we'll see you next time. Bye now.
Take care.